2 days. That's all that's left before the Cincinnati Bengals put pads on for the first time in 2026, and while everybody's been floating on cloud nine about Dexter Lawrence and this defense getting a total facelift, the injury report just dropped a name that should have every single person in that fan base paying close attention. Dre here, from Dre Talk Sports, and training camp officially opens Wednesday, but before we even get one snap of real football, there is already drama. There is already an injury situation, and there are already contract storylines bubbling right below the surface that could define whether this season goes exactly the way everybody's expecting or whether it gets complicated fast. Let's get into every single one of them, because there is a lot to unpack before the pads even come on. Let's start with the news that dropped over the weekend, because it's the one thing that actually stopped the offseason hype train in its tracks for a second. J. Hill has been placed on the physically unable to perform list heading into camp. Now, before anybody panics, let's be clear about what that actually means. The PUP list means Hill can't practice, can't play, but he can still be in meetings, still be around the building, still be part of this team in every way except stepping onto that practice field. And the injury itself, as of right now, it's undisclosed. Nobody outside that building knows exactly what's going on with BJ. Hill's body, and that mystery alone is enough to get the rumor mill spinning. Is this a fresh injury from something that happened during these last couple weeks of so-called summer vacation, when players are technically off the NFL's clock but still training on their own? Or is this something that's been quietly lingering since last season, finally catching up with him right as camp opens? We genuinely don't know, and I think that uncertainty is part of why this story has legs. Let's talk numbers for a second on Hill, because I think context matters more than panic here. He's 31 years old now, entering his 5th season in Cincinnati after the Bengals traded for him back in 2021, and across those years he's quietly put together 291 tackles and 20 sacks in 81 games. That's not a household name outside of Cincinnati, but that's a genuinely productive, dependable interior defender who's been the steady hand up front through some rough defensive stretches. This isn't the first time his body's given him trouble either. He dealt with a foot issue that put him in a walking boot during last year's offseason program too, and he still went out and played all 17 games once the lights actually came on. That track record of playing through discomfort matters when you're trying to gauge how worried to actually be about an undisclosed injury in late July. Here's what I do know. Hill played all 17 games last season. 66 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, and by Pro Football Focus's grading, he was the Bengals' best interior defensive lineman in what was otherwise a nightmare year for that defense as a whole. He did it, by the way, while dealing with a foot issue that limited him for stretches. So this is a guy who's played through pain before and still shown up and produced. That matters when we're talking about whether this is a big deal or a small deal. And crucially, and this is the part that actually changes the whole conversation from where it would have been a year ago, BJ, Hill is no longer the engine this defensive line runs on. A year ago, if Hill went down before camp, you're looking at Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson getting rushed onto the field as your primary interior pieces, and that's a scary thought for a defense that finished dead last in the league against the run. This year, Dexter Lawrence is in that building. Jonathan Allen is in that building. Hill now slots in as a rotational piece behind 2 proven established difference makers rather than the engine the whole unit depends on. That's not me downplaying an injury for the sake of staying positive. That's just the honest structural difference between this situation in July of 2026 versus where it would have sat 12 months earlier. Zach Taylor himself struck an optimistic tone at the pre-camp media luncheon, saying flatly that the team has already seen what it needs to see from Hill, and the priority now is just making sure he's ready to roll for Week 1 against Tampa Bay. Not that he grinds through every single padded rep in the middle of July heat. But here's where I want to zoom out for a second, because this injury, whatever it ends up being, is a reminder of something bigger that this fan base needs to internalize walking into camp. Everything has gone Cincinnati's way this offseason. The Dexter Lawrence trade, Jonathan Allen, the secondary overhaul, the offensive line staying fully intact. It has been about as clean an offseason as this organization has had in years, and it is very, very easy when everything's going right to start assuming it's just going to keep going right. It won't. Football is a violent, physical sport, and training camp injuries happen to every single team in this league every single summer. Just look at what's already happened elsewhere around the NFL this month, teams dealing with multiple tackle injuries before they've even put pads on. Cincinnati's first taste of that reality just arrived in the form of B.J. Hill on the PUP list, and I think the correct read here isn't panic, it's perspective. This is what training camp is. There are going to be more of these moments over the next few weeks. The character of this roster, and honestly the character of this coaching staff, gets tested in how they handle exactly this kind of adversity, not in how clean everything looked in May and June when nobody was hitting anybody. Now let's talk about the storyline that's flying almost completely under the radar right now, and it's one I think deserves a lot more attention than it's getting: the contract situations for Dax Hill, DJ Turner, and Chase Brown. All three of these guys are entering contract years. All three have been genuinely important pieces of what this roster is building toward, and none of them have signed extensions yet as camp opens. Here's where it actually gets interesting, though, because the picture isn't the same for all three. DJ Turner appears to be closing in on a deal. His agent posted a cryptic but clearly celebratory message on social media a few weeks back, hinting an extension is close, and reporting out of Cincinnati suggests Turner himself has said he's real hopeful it gets done before week 1. Turner set new career highs across the board last season. A career-high 89% snap share, 2 interceptions, 18 pass deflections, and by Pro Football Focus's own grading, he played like the 4th best cover corner in the entire NFL. That's not a guy you let walk. That's a guy you pay, and it sounds like the front office agrees, because he's reportedly the priority getting handled first. Dax Hill and Chase Brown are a different story, and this is where the hold in question actually becomes worth asking. Hill is playing on his 5th-year option this season, set to make just under $13 million, and he had arguably the best season of his career in 2025, playing all 17 games, finishing with 11 pass deflections, and posting career-best numbers in both completion percentage and passer rating allowed once he settled in full-time at outside corner. Chase Brown, meanwhile, is coming off back-to-back seasons, proving he can be a legitimate every-down back, and he's doing it on what's still relatively team-friendly money. Reporting out of Cincinnati has made clear the front office wants to get deals done with both of these guys, along with defensive end Myles Murphy, but with Turner's deal reportedly eating up the most immediate bandwidth and cap consideration, Hill and Brown are stuck waiting their turn. So here's the actual question worth asking heading into Wednesday. Does that waiting game turn into something uglier? Because here's the thing about hold-ins in the modern NFL, and I want to explain this clearly because I don't think casual fans always understand the mechanics of it. A hold-in isn't a player not showing up. Showing up and refusing to practice gets you fined $50,000 a day under this collective bargaining agreement. And for guys who aren't yet making the truly life-changing money of a second contract, that fine actually stings in a real way. So what you see instead, more and more across this league, is exactly what a hold-in is. A guy shows up, checks the box, avoids the fine, and then does the bare minimum on the practice field while his agent works the phones behind the scenes trying to get a deal across the finish line. We saw this exact movie play out with Jamar Chase a couple years back. And here's the part that should make Bengals fans a little nervous. Even though Chase went on to have a genuinely brilliant season, it was obvious watching him in those first couple of games that his mind wasn't fully locked in. He looked, and I'm being generous here, a little off, a little distracted, clearly carrying the weight of an unresolved contract into games that actually counted. Could that same movie play out with Dax Hill or Chase Brown this year if their deals bleed past the start of the season? I think it's a real possibility, and I think it's one of the more quietly important storylines to track over these next few weeks, even though right now, both guys have been model citizens about it, showing up to OTAs, playing through it, letting their representation handle the business side while they focus on football. That professionalism is admirable. Whether it holds if September rolls around and there's still no ink on the page is the real question. Let's dig even deeper into why this specific trio matters so much, because I don't think casual fans fully appreciate how differently these three situations could play out. Start with the money already on this roster, because it frames everything. Cincinnati is already carrying enormous long-term investment in its offensive core. Joe Burrow at $55 million a year, Jamar Chase as one of the highest-paid receivers in the league until a couple recent deals nudged past him, T. Higgins locked in after once requesting a trade out of frustration over his own contract situation a few years back. Layer on top of that the brand new money committed to Dexter Lawrence's extension, Boye Mafe, and Brian Cook, and you start to see why this front office, even with real cap flexibility remaining, has to be deliberate and sequential about how it stacks these next three deals rather than writing checks to everybody simultaneously. That's not an excuse for slow playing anybody, it's just the mechanical reality of building a roster this deep around a max contract quarterback. And that sequencing question is exactly why Turner getting done first makes sense on paper, but also exactly why it creates real pressure on the timeline for Hill and Brown. If Turner's deal eats up the bulk of the immediate cap attention and front office bandwidth this summer, Hill and Brown could very realistically still be sitting there unresolved when the games start counting, which is precisely the scenario that turned into a minor distraction with Chase a couple years back. I want to be fair to this front office here too, because it's not like they've been dragging their feet on purpose. Reporting out of Cincinnati has consistently framed this as a want-to-get-it-done situation on both sides, not a standoff. But wanting to get something done and actually getting it done before September are two very different outcomes, and this organization's own recent history suggests the gap between those two things tends to be wider here than it probably should be. Let's also talk about why Dax Hill's situation specifically is more layered than people give it credit for. Remember, this is a guy who was drafted in the first round back in 2022, essentially as an insurance policy against exactly this kind of situation. Cincinnati took him knowing full well they might eventually need a hedge against losing pieces in the secondary to free agency or cap constraints. Now, 4 years later, Hill himself is the piece in question. And the irony of that isn't lost on anybody who's followed this front office closely. He bounced around positionally for stretches of his early career too. Some safety, some nickel, some outside corner, before finally settling in full-time on the boundary last season and having what was statistically the best year of his career. That kind of positional versatility is exactly what makes a player valuable to a scheme like Al Golden wants to run, but it can also complicate contract negotiations, because it's genuinely harder to pin down comparable market value for a hybrid defensive back than it is for a player who's only ever played one clearly defined role. Chase Brown's situation is a little more straightforward on paper, but no less important. Back-to-back 1,000-yard scrimmage seasons, a genuine three-down role in this offense, and he's doing it all on money that, relative to what leadbacks are earning elsewhere around this league right now, still counts as a bargain. That's exactly the kind of situation where a front office can either reward the player proactively and lock in cost certainty, or wait another year and risk the price tag climbing the same way it did with Jamar Chase, whose value only went up the longer Cincinnati waited to extend him. If I'm this front office, I'd rather be paying Chase Brown now, on this year's number, than a year from now after another workhorse season potentially pushes his market value into a completely different bracket. And look, I have to say something here that I think doesn't get said enough about this organization specifically. There is something genuinely strange about how long these negotiations tend to take in Cincinnati. It's not just a one-time thing, it's practically become a pattern. It feels, more often than with most franchises around this league, like these deals bleed right into the regular season instead of getting buttoned up during the actual offseason when there's nothing else going on. You have months, literally months, where the entire roster is essentially on summer break, doing individual training. No games, no real football being played anywhere. And then training camp starts, everybody's in the building every single day, coaches are right there, front office is right there, and somehow it still takes until October or November to get pen to paper on deals that, on paper, both sides clearly want to get done. I don't fully understand the mechanics of why that happens. There are 100 moving pieces in any NFL negotiation that outsiders like us will never fully see, but from the outside looking in, it's one of the more consistently puzzling parts of how this front office operates, and it's worth watching closely whether that pattern repeats itself with Hill, Brown, and Murphy this summer. All right, Let's shift to something a lot more fun to talk about. What is this team actually going to do with its most valuable player once the preseason rolls around? Because this has been a real conversation in Cincinnati for the last couple of years, and I think it deserves way more attention than it's getting right now, especially given how little chatter there's been about it this offseason compared to a year ago. Remember, Zach Taylor made a deliberate, conscious choice last summer to change his approach and get Joe Burrow real preseason snaps, real reps, after years of the Bengals stumbling out of the gate in September and then having to dig themselves out of a hole. And look, it actually worked, at least in terms of getting off to a fast start. Cincinnati opened 2-0 last year. But here's the uncomfortable part of that story that doesn't get brought up nearly enough. There was a moment in that preseason where Burrow was out there scrambling around, extending a play that meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of a football season, and took a real shot. And plenty of people, myself included if I'm being honest, were sitting there thinking, what in the world is a franchise quarterback doing taking unnecessary hits in a game that has zero bearing on anything real? So what happens this year? Nobody is talking about this nearly as much as they were 12 months ago, and I find that fascinating, because the calculus honestly hasn't changed all that much. This is still a team that has had brutal starts to seasons in recent memory, still a team whose head coach clearly believes rhythm and reps matter enough to risk some exposure in games that don't count. My honest take, and I want to give you a real opinion here instead of just laying out both sides and walking away. I think there's a smarter middle ground than what we saw play out last summer. Play your defense. Play them extensively, honestly, because that unit needs every single rep it can get, building chemistry between Dexter Lawrence, Jonathan Allen, B.J. Hill, assuming he's healthy, and this retooled secondary. These are new pieces who have never played meaningful snaps together, and the preseason is exactly the environment built for working out that kind of unfamiliarity before it costs you a game that actually matters. But offensively, and specifically with Joe Burrow, give him a drive, maybe two. Get his timing sharp, get him comfortable, and then get him out of there. You don't need him deep into the second quarter of a preseason game taking hits from backup defenders trying to make a roster. The offense, outside of the quarterback position, has been running largely the same core system for half a decade now. This group doesn't need extensive preseason reps together the way a defense that just added multiple new starters absolutely does. That's the balance I'd want to see if I were running this thing, and I think it's a conversation this fan base should be having a lot louder than it currently is, given how quiet it's been compared to a year ago. Now let's get into what might be the single most fascinating storyline of this entire training camp. What does Al Golden's defense actually look like in year two? Because here's the reality that I don't think gets said bluntly enough. When Zach Taylor made the call to bring Al Golden back after one rocky season as a first-time NFL defensive coordinator, it wasn't exactly a layup decision. Taylor's public rationale was that the defense played a lot better down the stretch of last season, and that's a factually true statement. This defense was giving up under 20 points a game on average by the end of the year. But let's be real about the other piece of that calculation too. Firing your defensive coordinator after 1 year, on the heels of already firing the guy before him, would have been an awful look for a head coach who's already facing real pressure of his own. Golden had never been an NFL defensive coordinator before taking this job. He'd been a positional coach in this league and a defensive coordinator at a major college program, but the jump to calling plays on Sundays in the NFL is an entirely different animal, and by every account he faced real early season adversity and found a way to get this group playing better football exactly when it mattered late in the year. So what changes in year two? Here's what I'm watching closely, and I think it's the single biggest tell of training camp for this entire defense. Does Al Golden's scheme actually look more versatile now that he has dramatically better pieces to work with? At Notre Dame, by most accounts, his defense leaned heavily on straight man coverage, and that's a scheme that simply doesn't hold up consistently against NFL-caliber offenses week after week. You need exotic looks, you need disguise, you need the kind of positional versatility that lets you show one thing pre-snap and play something completely different after the ball snapped. And now Golden has real pieces to build that with. A rookie in Cassius Harris who reportedly gives him juice both rushing the passer and dropping into coverage. a safety in Kyle Duggar, who's built for exactly that kind of chess piece versatility, and obviously the anchor of Dexter Lawrence and Brian Cook, giving him legitimately good football players to build disguises around instead of scheme-dependent role players trying to overachieve. Watching how creative Golden gets with these pieces once pads come on Wednesday is, in my opinion, the single most important storyline of this entire training camp, more than any specific player battle, more than any specific injury update. If this defense looks multiple, looks disguised, looks like it's playing chess instead of checkers, that's the signal this whole season could go exactly the way everybody's hoping. And speaking of players stepping up, let's talk about who's going to flash in camp, because somebody always does, every single year, and it's one of the most fun parts of this entire process. You're watching practice, and all of a sudden there's a guy who looks completely different than he did as a rookie. And you start thinking, wait, this dude might actually be something. The hope, obviously, if you're this Bengals organization, is that it's Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight Jr. Taking that leap from promising rookie tackle numbers into legitimate difference makers in year 2, that's exactly the story this front office needs to be true for this defense to reach its ceiling. But keep an eye on some other names too. Chris Jenkins, going from year 2 to year 3, still developing behind a much deeper defensive tackle room now. McKinley Jackson, in a similar spot. Shamar Stewart, entering year 2 after a rookie season that had real flashes mixed with real inconsistency. Can he take that jump the way Myles Murphy did before him? These are exactly the storylines training camp exists to answer, and I promise you, by the time the pads come off in a couple weeks, we're going to have real answers on at least a couple of these names, one way or another. There's actually a third option here worth mentioning too, because it's become increasingly common around this league as an alternative to both extremes, the joint practice, or full intra-squad scrimmage against another team's roster. Zach Taylor has leaned on this exact tool before, scrimmaging against the Rams, the Packers, and the Bears in recent years, and there's real logic behind why more coaches are trending this direction. You get a controlled environment, no real scoreboard pressure, but you still get live competitive reps against unfamiliar opponents, which is exactly what a defense full of new starters needs without the increased injury risk that comes with an actual preseason game where backups from the other team are fighting for their careers and playing with reckless abandon. If Cincinnati goes this route again this summer, it would likely serve as the final real tune-up for Burrow, Chase, Higgins, and the rest of the core before the games start actually counting. And frankly, given everything I just said about wanting Burrow's exposure limited, that's probably the smartest version of this whole preseason equation. Get him competitive reps in a semi-controlled setting. Save the live-fire preseason snaps for the defense that genuinely needs them the most. Let's add 2 more storylines to the pile, because I think they're both being underrated relative to how much they could actually shape this team. First, the second safety spot next to Brian Cook. Cook himself was never really in question once Cincinnati brought him in this offseason. He was essentially handed the number 1 job on arrival, and by all accounts, he's been exactly the kind of secure, physical presence this front office hoped for, but who lines up next to him is genuinely still unresolved heading into Wednesday. Jordan Battle held down that job for most of last season and didn't have a standout year doing it, which is precisely why the front office went out and added Kyle Duggar on a 1-year deal instead of simply running it back with Battle by default. Duggar brings exactly the kind of positional versatility Al Golden's defense wants at that spot, a guy who's played extensively both in the box and in the slot over his career, giving this scheme the disguise and flexibility it was missing for long stretches of last season. Does Duggar walk in and win that job outright? Or does Battle hold on and prove last year was more about scheme confusion than individual talent? That competition alone could tell us a lot about how willing this coaching staff is to bench a younger, cheaper option in favor of a proven veteran when the difference isn't enormous on paper, but could be real on tape. And it's worth noting just how crowded that back end of the secondary has become. Cincinnati made 3 separate outside additions aimed at safety and slot corner this offseason between Cook, Duggar, and free agent corner Jasir Taylor, which tells you this front office viewed that part of the roster as needing serious swelling and competition, not just a single splashy fix. Second, Let's talk about a battle at a completely different spot on the roster that deserves way more buzz than it's currently getting. Tight end. Mike Gesicki was Cincinnati's leading receiver at the position last season, even missing a 5-game stretch with a pectoral injury, and he had real moments, including a 6-catch, 86-yard, 1-touchdown performance in a snowy divisional battle against Buffalo that showed exactly why this staff values him as a legitimate weapon in the passing game. But here's the twist that's flying under the radar. Eric All Jr. is reportedly fully healthy now after an ankle injury wiped out most of his rookie campaign, and by draft pedigree and physical upside. He might have the highest ceiling of anybody in that tight end room. If All comes out of camp looking like the player his draft profile always suggested he could be, that's a real problem in the best possible way for a coaching staff trying to figure out how to divide targets in an offense that's already loaded at receiver and running back. Watching how those reps get split over these next few weeks will tell us a lot about which direction this staff wants to take that position group heading into the season. Let's talk about why all of this actually connects into one bigger theme, because I don't want you walking away from this thinking these are 7 random disconnected storylines. Every single one of them, the BJ Hill injury, the contract situations, the preseason strategy debate, Al Golden's scheme in year 2, the safety competition, and the tight end battle, all come back to the exact same underlying question. Is this organization going to manage the details as well as it managed the headline additions? Because here's the uncomfortable truth about roster building in this league. Getting the splashy names right is actually the easier part. Anybody with enough cap space and draft capital can go get a Dexter Lawrence if ownership is willing to spend and the front office is willing to be aggressive. What separates the teams that go all the way from the teams that look great on paper and then quietly underachieve is almost always the boring stuff. It's whether you get your ascending young corner locked up before his price tag explodes. It's whether you manage a veteran defensive tackle's recovery timeline correctly instead of rushing him back too early for a meaningless July practice. It's whether your second-year defensive coordinator actually builds on the multiplicity his personnel now allows, instead of running back the exact same base concepts that got exposed for a full season before he found his footing late. None of these storylines are the kind of thing that gets a highlight reel or a viral clip. Nobody's making a hype video out of a contract negotiation update or a pup list press release. But I promise you, when we look back on this season in January, however it ends, a meaningful chunk of that outcome traces directly back to how this organization handled exactly these unglamorous details in the 2 weeks leading into camp and the 6 weeks of camp and preseason that follow. That's the case I'm making with this video, and it's why I wanted to walk through all of these storylines together instead of just picking the flashiest one and running with it. One more thing worth flagging before we wrap up, because it's easy to forget in the middle of talking about extensions and injury lists, the slot cornerback job behind Turner and Hill remains the most wide-open competition on this entire roster. Jalen Davis enters camp as the incumbent after playing well down the stretch last year, but he's got real competition now from free agent signing Josser Taylor, from Kyle Duggar sliding inside given his versatility, and from a hungry, undrafted second-year player in Brawlin Lux, who's reportedly been getting real first-team reps this offseason. That battle alone could determine multiple roster spots and several tough final cuts come late August, and how Al Golden handles it will tell us a lot about whether he trusts internal development at a premium coverage position or whether this front office ends up needing to explore outside help before Week 1. These battles won't make national headlines, but they'll shape which 46 players are actually active and available once the games start counting, and that matters just as much as any splashy offseason acquisition. So here's where I land on all of this heading into Wednesday. Genuinely, structurally, this is about as clean an entry into training camp as this organization has had in years. No major star publicly unhappy. No trade demands hanging over the building, a fully retooled defense finally getting its first real look in live action, and a quarterback who by every account has more say over how this offense operates than at any point in his career. But clean doesn't mean risk-free, and I think the smart move for anybody following this team closely is to hold both of those truths at the same time. The BJ Hill situation is a reminder that injuries are coming, whether we like it or not, and how this staff manages the ones that show up over these next few weeks says a lot about how prepared they actually are for a real championship push. The Turner, Hill, and Brown contract situations are a reminder that even a drama-free offseason narrative has real loose threads still hanging. And how quickly this front office ties those off could genuinely affect how these guys show up mentally once September football actually starts counting. And Al Golden's scheme, whatever it looks like once real 11-on-11 reps start on Wednesday, is going to tell us more about this defense's true ceiling than any offseason headline about Dexter Lawrence ever could. Training camp football isn't glamorous. It's not the Super Bowl. It's not even a preseason game that means anything on the scoreboard. But it's the first real data we're going to get on a roster that the entire league has spent this whole offseason getting excited about, and I, for one, cannot wait to see what it actually looks like once the pads finally come on. All right, that's going to do it for this one. Lots to track over these next few weeks. The BJ Hill recovery timeline, whether Turner's extension gets across the finish line and what that means for Hill and Brown, and what Al Golden's defense actually looks like once live reps start. If you've got a name you think is going to flash in camp, or a storyline you think I slept on here, drop it in the comments, because I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed to Dre Talk Sports yet, hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, because we are going to be tracking every single practice report, every roster move, and every storyline all the way through camp and into the regular season. Bengals fans, real football starts Wednesday. Let's go.